Great. Thank you, James. Thanks so much. And I also want to say thanks to Maggie and Rachel and Mara and Dominic for helping us kick this whole project off. I've been so blessed in these difficult times of isolation and stay-at-home orders, and now, as James said, this terrible unrest in our country. And yet, by working with James and the Kennedy Library, not only have I been able to continue my research, but also be able to feel much less isolated and feel like there's a positivity that we can all hold on to in these difficult times. And I think both Eleanor Roosevelt and President Kennedy would be pleased that we're trying to think in positive ways to meet these challenges. So with that, James, can we go to our second slide and say welcome to everyone today to explore these themes with us. James mentioned the dwindling numbers of people in the country and the world who remember President Kennedy personally, and I guess I would be the youngest among that cohort because my mother took me to see then Senator John F. Kennedy when I was 4 years old in our hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, sadly just around where all the troubles are happening right now in my hometown. That's where my mother took me to see him as he campaigned through our city in 1960, and it was because she felt very tied to him, I think because he was of her generation. He, of course, was a World War II veteran, as was my dad. And we're Catholic. And of course, he became the first and to this day, only Catholic president of the United States. So I want to talk a little bit about these two amazing historic figures, Eleanor Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy, in the context of their family dynasties. The clash of these democratic titans, one being more idealistic than the other, one being more pragmatic, but finding a meeting of the minds for both idealism and pragmatism when necessary. The fact that they had differences sometimes on civil rights and civil liberties. And so I call Mrs. Roosevelt, although she would use this term to refer to her formidable mother-in-law, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, she would call her the Grande Dame. But I actually think that Eleanor Roosevelt was the formidable Grande Dame of the Democratic Party as Senator John F. Kennedy was exploring running for president. And she sometimes referred to him a bit condescendingly before they had a meeting of the minds as my dear boy. So when you move on to this third slide, we'll go ahead and move on to that, James, that these two families really, while they have very many similarities in that they do become the two most potent political dynasties, chasing the American dream, they capture it. They show us a way to capture the American dream. And they go, in the case of the Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds, who came to Boston 2 generations before President Kennedy, dirt poor, victims of the Irish potato famine in the 1850s, but very quickly rise through the ranks and become those of privilege, as the Roosevelts had very early on. They had actually come in the 1640s to Manhattan from Holland, or New Amsterdam as Manhattan was called then. And they very quickly became planters and landowners and farmers. So they moved into the privileged category quite quickly. But then both families devoted their time, their talent, their resources, their stewardship to purpose and to public purpose, thank goodness, including Joe Kennedy, Sr., the president's father, who worked in the 1932 FDR campaign, contributed money to it, helped to write speeches for it, and for his work, ultimately in the late 30s, just prior to World War II, was named by FDR as the ambassador to the court of St. James, and also would deal quite frequently with James Roosevelt, who was Eleanor and Franklin's eldest son, and James became an aide to his dad and would work with Joe Kennedy, and they became friends. So there had been these crossovers among the two families and between the two families. So if we can go to the next category here, James. Then I refer to this as this clash of Democratic titans, and that is Eleanor Roosevelt versus Jack Kennedy. She's the more progressive, the more idealistic come the 1950s on issues that we'll talk about momentarily. And Kennedy is just a little bit more moderate, I think, by his own politics, but also he has to know that he is going to have to persuade and keep on board the conservatives in the Democratic Party, particularly those Southerners, the Southern wing of the party when the South was solidly Democratic. So the New Deal coalition that FDR had put together of labor and blacks and Southern whites and Catholics and Jews and the poor and intellectuals and farmers and urban residents. And we should add women to that as well, all trying to be held together, but in different ways. So FDR had to face the Southern Democrats from his time in office from 1933 until his death in 45. His successor, Harry Truman, his vice president, who vaults into the presidency in 1945, by the time he runs in his own right in 48, because of a very liberal civil rights plank that Hubert Humphrey helped to place into the platform. The Dixiecrats, the Southern conservatives, the segregationists, bolt from the party, led by then Democrat Strom Thurmond, the senator from South Carolina. He runs as a third party in 1948 as a Dixiecrat. So Truman had his problems with him. And then Eleanor Roosevelt and Adlai Stevenson, as the more progressive wing of the party, are really in some ways counter to Kennedy's more moderate approach. And you can think of it in today's view. I would say Eleanor Roosevelt, Adlai Stevenson were a bit more like Bernie Sanders' wing of the Democratic Party, and we would probably place JFK in the Joe Biden wing today. So from that period of 56 to 60, when Kennedy was really starting his run for the presidency, this is what he was facing in terms of the most recent history in the party. But Eleanor stuck with Adlai Stevenson, her progressive darling. She was madly for Adlai, as the saying went, both when he was nominated in 52 at the top of the ticket, but lost to Eisenhower. Renominated he was in 56 by the Democrats, lost again to Eisenhower. Eleanor wanted him to be nominated a third time. Let's move on and see what happens, James. Eleanor did not use this quote, but there were some who did. Because Senator Kennedy had written this Pulitzer Prize-winning book about courageous members of Congress, which I know sounds a bit like an oxymoron these days, but yes, indeed, in history, there have been courageous members of Congress, and he wrote about them and won the Pulitzer Prize with his 1957 book, Profiles in Courage. But there were some people in the party, again, who were more progressive, and he was more moderate, who would sometimes say he was all profile and no courage. And again, we can't attribute this to Eleanor Roosevelt, but you'll see in momentarily that she did pick out part of this to poke a stick in the eye of Senator Kennedy at one point. And why is that? Why does she have these differences with him? Well, she thinks that he was not strong enough in fighting McCarthyism when McCarthy Red Scare swept through the nation in the 1950s. It so happened that Senator Kennedy was absent because he was in the hospital, nearly died of a back surgery that went awry in the early 1950s, 1954. And it is the case that he was not there when the Senate voted to condemn and ultimately censure Joe McCarthy. And so Eleanor Roosevelt wondered, well, you know, what was going on there? Well, the fact was that Kennedy and the family were friends with Joe McCarthy, despite the fact that he was Republican, but he was an Irish Catholic. And Jack Kennedy knew, and Joe Kennedy Sr. knew politically, that many Catholics in Massachusetts supported Joe McCarthy, and many Catholics, of course, were anti-communist. So there was a friendship, and there was a political friendship and collegiality there among the Kennedy family with Joe McCarthy. That grated on Eleanor Roosevelt, the great civil libertarian's viewpoint. Also, Eleanor wondered why Jack Kennedy didn't push harder for civil rights. For example, when the 1957 Civil Rights Bill was being pushed through the Senate, she wanted to see more progressivism from him. And we've already said he was worried about that because he didn't want to do anything that would put off the Southern wing, which he knew he needed not only to get the nomination, but to win the presidency. She also worried, not because she thought badly of Catholicism, although there is a friend and colleague of hers called Joe Lash, who wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of her and Franklin in the 1970s. And he said he thought there was a little bit of anti-Catholicism in Eleanor Roosevelt because of her quite staid Episcopal Northeastern background that she had. But I would say it was really more a policy difference. She worried that Kennedy might want to support federal funding for Catholic schools, which he did not. He believed in separation of church and state, as did she, but she had also gone toe to toe on policy with the Cardinal of New York, Francis Cardinal Spellman, and he was a friend of the Kennedy family, so she worried about that as well. And then finally, and we'll see back and forth momentarily between the two of them, in fact, I think we can move on to it now, James, that she wondered if Joe Kennedy, with all his money, was attempting to buy the election of 1960, buy the nomination and then buy the election for his son, Jack. And so I've included here several letters and telegrams. So one is on the left is a letter from Senator Kennedy to Eleanor Roosevelt. He always called her Mrs. Roosevelt, even when he was president. Dear Mrs. Roosevelt, he would say, and he'd be very diplomatic, but he'd say in this letter in 1958, I understand that you have said on TV, and it's been reported in the press, that my father is spending, quote, oodles of money for my election. And I just wondered what your evidence is for that. And so she replies at the top here at December 8th, 1958, that she would be happy to change her view if only he would show that what she said was incorrect. And so there's, at the Kennedy Library, there are digitized versions of this back and forth conversation that they're having in their letters all through 1958 and into 1959, where Mrs. Roosevelt, again, is kind of poking a stick in his eye, and the senator is trying to remain friendly and trying to remain, I think, diplomatic, but also not wanting this view, which he believes is quite incorrect, to be shipped around the country. And so it seems like they've come to a rapprochement over this issue, but then Mrs. Roosevelt sends at the beginning of 1959 this "my dear boy" telegram to Senator Kennedy. She literally addresses him "my dear boy," and she says that she has learned in her long life that when criticism is raining down on one, it's better to turn the other profile. So that's that, you know, again, kind of a stick in the eye regarding his Profiles in Courage book. So we'll move on then to look at how they ended up smiling broadly as they exited the lunch that they had in August of 1960 at Mrs. Roosevelt's cottage at Hyde Park, which is called Baliles. Mrs. Roosevelt did go to the convention in Los Angeles in 1960. She still wanted, as we said, Adlai Stevenson to be nominated, and she was quite disappointed when my dear boy, Jack Kennedy, was given the nomination. And in a bit of a huff, she was flying out of Los Angeles, leaving the convention. And Senator Kennedy, now the new nominee, tried to call her to say that he hoped that they could get together and that he wanted to see if she could join in his campaign. And she wouldn't take the call. She got word to him that he should send any messages through her son, Franklin Jr. He was good friends with Senator Kennedy. So she said, if you have anything to say, just tell Franklin Jr. But as it turned out, in August of 60, a few weeks after the convention, Kennedy went to Hyde Park to give a speech on the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Social Security bill by Franklin Roosevelt, and to lay a wreath at his gravesite at Hyde Park and speak then to a group of senior citizens who'd obviously benefited from Social Security. So Mrs. Roosevelt invited the president for a lunch at her cottage at Baliles, despite the fact that just 2 days before, her beloved teenage granddaughter, who lived nearby, had been killed in a horse riding accident at her summer camp. And Senator Kennedy wrote a lovely message to her and said, I understand your family tragedy. Of course, he was no stranger to that. And he said, if you don't want me to have lunch, I certainly understand. And she said, no, I understand how busy a presidential candidate's life is. So you come on and we'll have lunch. So you can see a bit of a blurry picture there of them having lunch. She held forth, and then they did come to their rapprochement. And that is why they are smiling both so broadly as they exit. And a month or two later, then Senator Kennedy, now running hard for the presidency, was in New York and went to visit Eleanor Roosevelt at her townhouse in Manhattan. And I can tell that he's carrying either a book or maybe a long play record album set. And it looks like it says something like maybe FDR Speaks. And I bet she gave that to him as a gift for him as he was leaving. I'm going to be doing a little more research on this. This is for a book that I'm doing on Eleanor Roosevelt and Jack Kennedy and their political partnership. So I'll still be doing research through the Hyde Park Library and certainly through the John F. Kennedy Library. So I'm going to try to trace down exactly what she gave to him. But the key for Kennedy was that as Isaiah had said, come let us reason together, they were now reasoning together. Instead of being on different wings of the party, they were working together in unity. And Mrs. Roosevelt went around the country. She did interviews, she did lectures. She got in a convertible and was driven around the little towns of West Virginia, where she and her husband were deities in that poor state, which at that time was a Democratic state, big D and small d. And the phrase on the button, as you can see there, where she's giving a press conference is, "It seems to me it's Kennedy." Next. And the president, to show again their new relationship and partnership, invited her as the former First Lady to come to his inauguration and to sit on the stage with him outside the Capitol, just behind the podium where he would give his inaugural address. There was another former First Lady there, Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, the second Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, who was still alive in 1961. She sat up near the president, but Eleanor Roosevelt, who was quite a modest woman, sat down in what I call the cheap seat. So you can see she's looking up towards the stage, but she sat with her fur coat and that was when that was not politically incorrect to have a fur coat. So it was bitterly cold. She had her fur coat and an army blanket, they said, around her. And I want to read to you, because her handwriting is a little bit hard to decipher, what she wrote to the president a couple of days later, now from the warmth of Arizona where she had retreated. She said, "Oh, dear Mr. President," not calling him my dear boy anymore, "I wanted to tell you how I felt about your inaugural address. I think," and she put in quotes, "gratitude best describes I think it's the word sense, the sense of liberation and lift of the speech which you gave. I have reread your words several times, and I am filled with thankfulness. May we all respond to your leadership and make your task easier. With all good wishes to you and your wife, cordially yours, Eleanor Roosevelt." Next, please. So once he was president, then they came together in three particularly really important areas. On the Peace Corps, the picture that you see on the left is Mrs. Roosevelt coming to the White House in March of 1961 when the president had issued his executive order creating the Peace Corps. She, by this time, had a television show, a talk show on educational TV in Boston, but she came to the White House and interviewed the president. We have included these links for you so you can either watch those 15 minutes or listen to them in audio version. But she's so thrilled about the Peace Corps because she had a really international view of the world. She had been a delegate to the UN in the 1940s, and she had written and helped to pass the Declaration of Human Rights, a worldwide document helping to guarantee human rights around the world. And she loved internationalism. She loved new languages. She spoke fluent French. She traveled throughout the world. And so she just speaks so supportively of the Peace Corps, and the president had put her on the advisory board of the Peace Corps. So they had a wonderful exchange on that. And then at the end of 1961, President Kennedy appointed Mrs. Roosevelt to chair his new President's Commission on the Status of Women, particularly looking at women in the workplace. And this is something Eleanor Roosevelt had been fighting for since the 1920s, for particularly equal pay for equal work. And so they're in the Oval Office as they begin this march forward on this commission. And that would be released, sadly, after she died in November of '62. But in May of '62, and you can even tell on the stage there in Manhattan, her health is beginning to fail. She's looking a little weaker. But the president spent a couple days in Manhattan in spring of '62, supporting his social policies, particularly a policy that he had to try to get government health insurance for the elderly. This would come to pass in 1965 as Medicare, but he was speaking for it in 1962, and Mrs. Roosevelt was very supportive of that too. So if we can go now, we're coming towards the end of our presentation here today. That unfortunately, Mrs. Roosevelt succumbed to ill health and the ravages of older age. She died at age 78 in November of 1962. And President Kennedy went to her funeral along with Mrs. Kennedy. You can see them there. She's about to be laid to rest next to her husband in the Rose Garden at Hyde Park. This also drew former President Truman, former President Eisenhower, Adlai Stevenson, the future President LBJ, Mrs. Johnson were there, Mrs. Truman, and Ralph Bunche. You can see just in the background on the right, the first African-American to be given the Nobel Peace Prize, and he was a great diplomat for the United Nations and a dear friend of Mrs. Roosevelt. And then in April of 1963, President Kennedy called to the Rose Garden of the White House Ambassador Stevenson. He had made him UN ambassador, and Franklin Roosevelt Jr., who was Secretary of the Navy, brought the son of Eleanor and Franklin to the White House to establish the Eleanor Roosevelt Foundation in a little speech that he gave. And finally, then, James, what did Mrs. Roosevelt miss in JFK's final year? He had one more year of life, as it turned out, after she passed. And I think she would have been so pleased, as he was too, that there were many of the things that they had partnered together or that she had wanted him to do, and maybe he was a little bit slower getting to them, but that he was making progress on in that final year. So his introduction of what became the Civil Rights Bill, an act of 1964, a very potent civil rights piece of legislation that came from his historic speech on race in 1963, and also his desegregation of the University of Alabama at that same time. In the same time period, he was giving the so-called peace speech at American University. In October of '63, just a month before his death, he signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Mrs. Roosevelt had been very interested in that and trying to have disarmament. The final report of the President's Commission on the Status of Women is released in October of '63. But even before that, based on its recommendations, President Kennedy signed the first Equal Pay Act for women. So I think he was living up to her words, you must do the thing you think you cannot do. And he was coming, I think, more towards the idealistic view that she had rather than the pragmatic. Because as he said in the peace speech in 1963 at American University, in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. James? And these are some questions that James and I have developed in part based on this content that we've presented to you today. And we know that you'll have more questions. And then, as I said to you, this is a book that I am currently writing on the political relationship between President Kennedy and former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, as she was called by President Truman, the First Lady of the world, and she was indeed. So if you have thoughts that you want to share with James or with me directly, please feel free, because it is a work in progress and I would love to have your feedback on it. So with that, I'll turn to our expert moderator, James.
Thank you. Please do submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There's also a chat that you can submit comments and make statements to. Barbara, our conversation, I'd really like to start while people are thinking. Our conversation started with the challenges that they faced, that John F. Kennedy faced earlier in his life, but you've also spoken about the young Eleanor Roosevelt and what that did to develop her into the person she became. I'm wondering if you could speak to some of those challenges and how they compared to President Kennedy.
Sure. Yes, a great question, and one that I'm learning more about. I think I knew a lot about President Kennedy because I've been following him and studying him, as I said to you, since I was 4, and my mother was giving me children's books about him. And I knew, again, the basics of Eleanor Roosevelt, but I'm learning much more about her biography and about all of her work in public service, even as a non-elected person. But she had a very, very sad childhood. She was orphaned by age 10. Her very beautiful but cold mother passed away very young when Eleanor was only 7. And then her father, whom she adored, but who suffered from alcoholism, died when she was 10. And she was taken in by her grandmother, who was also rather chilly towards her and called her an ugly duckling. Eleanor's mother was quite beautiful, and Eleanor was not the most beautiful child, and unfortunately, her grandmother would tell her that. And so she grew to adolescence as a very shy, introverted, damaged child. But she was sent off to Allenswood School in London, and she was taught by a mentor. The head of the school was called Madame Marie Souvestre. That's how she learned French. And that woman, that mentor, showed Eleanor that she had more than looks, that she had a mind, and that she had an intellect, and she taught her to be a lifelong learner, and she taught her to view the world in the broadest possible way. Now, when Eleanor Roosevelt came back to the United States, of course, she was living in a patriarchal family, in a patriarchal society, and so she was not encouraged to run for office, for example, but she, by this time now in the 1920s, as she moves through her married life and her husband contracts polio in 1921, she really becomes his public face in the world. He already knew he wanted a public life. He had run for the vice presidency on the Democratic ticket in 1920, so he already had his life's plot worked out, but didn't know he would get polio and be paralyzed from the waist down. So Eleanor was mentored by his aide, Louis Howe, taught her how to deal with the press, taught her how to do public speaking, get over her shyness as best she could. And in some ways, I would compare her to President Kennedy, who was not the apple of his parents' eye in his family. That belonged to his older brother, Joe Jr., who was killed in World War II. And the torch was passed in the Kennedy family to young Jack, but Jack was sort of the class clown in the family, and was frankly bullied by his older and much larger brother, Joe, and was not a great public speaker, much as Eleanor Roosevelt was not. So he had to learn how to communicate in public and how to change his life on a dime, the way that Eleanor had to when the tragedy of her husband's polio struck her.
We've got one question from Jay Berry. Is it fair to say that Eleanor Roosevelt greatly underestimated John F. Kennedy? And have you found anything to kind of see her more private reflections on President Kennedy?
Yes. I think, first of all, even her public ruminations that she was sharing with the world indicated that she was underestimating him, although it's possible because he was only in his early 40s. You know, he was only 43 when he was elected, the youngest elected president. It turns out it was Eleanor's uncle, Theodore Roosevelt, who was the youngest president ever at 42, assumed the presidency upon the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. But I would say that she was underestimating the potential of John F. Kennedy, which may not have been visible to lots of people, again, because of his relative youth. And we have to remember, she was the same generation as his mother. She was about 6 years older than his mother, but I think he viewed her as a mother figure, and I think she viewed him as my dear boy. So she thought that as there was a bit of a reputation of young Jack Kennedy before he married, particularly as a bit of a playboy. So she didn't think he was mature enough. She didn't think he had the experience to be president. She began to see by 1960 that she began to talk about in her column called My Day, which by that time was an every other day column in newspapers around the country. But she began to say that maybe she could see him as a vice presidential candidate with Adlai at the top of the ticket. So she did underestimate him. When she got to meet with him personally at Valkill, and this is going to be the pivotal dramatic point for my book, is that she wrote to a friend in New York that next day, and then she wrote in her My Day column, in essence, that she had underestimated him. She said she found him to be very bright. She found him to be open-minded. She found him to be someone who was open to new ideas. And this very much pleased her. And she was then moving towards not exactly saying she was going to work for him around the country, but that she would start to talk to her friends in New York who were power brokers in the Democratic Party. And that's exactly what she did. And then again, in her My Day column, all through the campaign, the general election, began to support him very strongly. And as I said earlier, campaigned for him around the country.
Barbara, what about the early life of John F. Kennedy? Would you point to any particular keystones that were symbolic or really powerful steps towards his own path to service? We've talked before about the kind of path from privilege to purpose, but what would you say are some of the key ingredients that led him to such a meaningful life of service?
Well, thank goodness for our country. It was, I always say for him, it was, and the same for the Roosevelts, it was in their DNA. So it was both nature and nurture, I think. In other words, they had their relatives. In the case of Franklin Roosevelt, it was, by the way, he and Eleanor were fifth cousins. So it was his cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, her uncle, Theodore Roosevelt, who had been president. And Franklin Roosevelt wanted to follow in his footsteps, and he did. He became an assistant secretary of the Navy. He became the governor of New York, and then, of course, president. In Jack Kennedy's case, it was his maternal grandfather, for whom he was named, John Fitzgerald, also known as Honey Fitz, who had been in Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives, in the 1890s, and had been in the 19 teens and 20s, the mayor of Boston. And so it was in the DNA, I think, of the Kennedys, but also that nurturing part was that the family would talk about public service. They would talk at the dinner table about public issues. And I think realized in that generation, and there's a wonderful dictation that Jack Kennedy did in 1960 before becoming president. We think he did it to think in terms of what his memoirs would be. But you can find it at the Miller Center site. I'm sure you can find it on the Kennedy Library site. Just look up Jack Kennedy biographical dictation. And in 1960, he talks into the dictaphone about why he chose this life of public service. And he said he didn't want to be in business, as his dad had been, though his dad did become ambassador to the court of St. James. And had a couple of other government positions in the Roosevelt administration, that he thought about business, didn't want to do that, thought about journalism. In fact, he covered the opening session of the UN in 1945, or at least the beginnings of the UN in 1945. But ultimately, he was drawn to public service, I think, to follow in his family's footsteps, but also to do good things for the country and to make our lives better.
We've got some wonderful questions coming in here, Barbara. One is, a two-part question. And I know this, historians are in high demand in unprecedented times, I believe. And I'm curious what questions are coming to you about either John F. Kennedy or presidential leadership at this time. And then the follow-up question from that person said, how did JFK win public trust so effectively when we're in a time when there's so much mistrust? What was it that could create a public sense of trust?
Well, let's go to that one first, because I think that's even I love the first one, but the second one, let's go to first, because I think that is the more important. Think in these terms, that when Gallup poll asked Americans during the Kennedy administration, did they have a great amount of trust and faith in the federal government, the national government, to do the right thing? 75% of Americans polled said yes. By the time we got to the mid-1970s, so we had gone through, sadly, the assassination of President Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Senator Robert Kennedy in his run in 1968 for office, the Vietnam War, and Watergate. When that question was posed to the American people in 1975, so just 15 years after Kennedy was elected, 25% of Americans said they had a great deal or quite a bit of faith and trust in the national government to do the right thing. So part of my reason for stating that is I believe that President Kennedy benefited from the fact that at that time Americans had a lot of faith and trust in the American government. And I think that they had a lot of faith and trust in him to do the right thing. And I can speak from personal experience to tell you that my mother, who was a bright woman, a lovely woman, was a homemaker, raising 3 baby boom children in the suburbs of Louisville, Kentucky. What possessed her she was not in politics, but she loved history and she loved politics, but she wasn't in politics. She was raising a family, and my dad was the sole breadwinner in a blue collar job. What possessed her to go to downtown Louisville, take 2 young boys and a 4-year-old, and she'd say, I got there extra early so that we could stand right in front of the podium and you could see him, and your brother shook his hand. I think it was something in his persona. I think it was his direct way of speaking to the people, his inspirational way of speaking to the people. I will say truly charismatic he was, as was Franklin Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt began to say about him, I think when she got to know him better, she would write to him and say, you know, you're like my husband. You are really able to engage the people. And that's what a leader needs to do. And that's what a president needs to do. And I think that's why Eleanor Roosevelt wrote that complimentary note to the president after his inaugural address. So that's the first lady. And then my mother, who was my first lady of our family, she was seeing that as a homemaker. She was being drawn to the president by his charisma, by his plain speaking, by his inspiration, and by the fact that, again, he was her generation. He was a war hero, and she could relate to him, I think, too, because of his Catholicism. And I would also say he was very handsome. He was a handsome young man, and I'm sure many people were drawn to him, men and women, because of that. He made a good presentation. And when he passed, there were studies done that people in the United States were grieving as if they had lost a member of their family. They had the same traits, that the same responses. They couldn't eat, they couldn't sleep, they were crying uncontrollably. And I remember in our family, my grandmothers, particularly my mother, speaking of President Kennedy as if they had lost a family member.
Eleanor Roosevelt's experience with the media. You've talked about her radio program, her writing as a columnist. JFK is also known as the first kind of TV president. I'm wondering if you can speak to the way these leaders used media and where they may have been pioneers, or what's notable about that.
Thank you for that question, because while I haven't been focusing specifically on that as I've been writing the book, that gives me something to ponder, and I will. Thank you. So yes, in Eleanor Roosevelt's case, of course, she was long before TV on the public scene, but again, because of her innate shyness, she really did need mentoring by Louis Howe, her husband's strong aide, who without him, probably Franklin Roosevelt would not have been elected president. And so in the 1920 campaign, which was led at the top of the Democratic ticket by James Cox, and Franklin Roosevelt running as the vice presidential nominee, they went on a train around the country. So Eleanor Roosevelt and Louis Howe had lots of time to talk to each other, and Louis Howe taught her how to deal with the media. So she felt very comfortable with the media. And then in the 1930s, as radio came on the scene, and we know her husband would use that to great effect, particularly with the fireside chats, but Eleanor Roosevelt would start appearing on, one was called the Pond's Dance Program on radio. Pond's was a cold cream, might still be a cold cream. And she would come on at the end of these music programs and give a little speech or lecture about a topic often related to women, and often related to the women who were suffering from the Great Depression and vast unemployment. So by the time she got into the White House, she already had experience in using radio. And then once she was First Lady, she was called back by various sponsors. They would pay her, and then she would use that money, give it to charity to help those suffering from the Great Depression. And she would either do a lecture or a short speech, or she'd interview people, for example, women labor leaders, and she would interview them about the plight women were facing. So then by the time she gets to be First Lady, she's using radio, her husband's using radio, and then she was very early adapter of television and would be interviewed on television. I just watched a video yesterday of her in 1959 on a television program with Frank Sinatra, and she does not attempt to sing, but she does a recitation of his song High Hopes, which I think was an Oscar winner. So she felt comfortable in any medium. President Kennedy, as we know, really stands on the shoulders of FDR. FDR mastered the newer medium of radio, and Kennedy the newer medium of television, particularly by putting on unprecedentedly his news conferences at night in prime time and turning them into an art and great entertainment, but giving the people information that they needed. But his great wit was always on display, and people flocked to those. Millions of people watched those. So you have two people who mastered the media of their age, and in the case of Eleanor Roosevelt, as the questioner indicated, mastered the television medium at the end of her life, radio prior to that, but also the printed word. So she, in her My Day column, starting at the end of 1935, she wrote 6 days a week, a column that went around to 60 newspapers. It was syndicated, and millions of people read it every day.
Barbara, thank you so much. We've got about a minute left,
Okay.
and I just, what comes to mind is the Happiness Project that we've discussed before, and President Kennedy's asked if he likes being president, and your joy and your expertise and your sense of purpose and how this all fits together is so inspiring to us. We have also, you and I together, and now this larger group, have really set out to take something that began as Profiles in Courage and think about our courage now. And there's so much that you've given us to think about, but also to continue to work towards. In your New Frontier Friday talk with Governor Deval Patrick, you recommended keeping a day book and thinking about and reflecting on these things as we're processing these challenging times. I wonder if you would just give a final thought to what you hope to see come out of the people that are a part of this New Frontier Forum, and how it may fit into the Kennedy legacy or the legacy of Eleanor Roosevelt as you've come to understand it.
Well, a lot to unpack there with just a minute to go, but I will say that, first of all, thank you again, James, for being our leader on this, along with your colleagues at the library. And thank you for all the library does to help us scholars be able to investigate President Kennedy and research him, and Eleanor Roosevelt as well, and of course the Hyde Park Presidential Library too, which was the first presidential library. But I would say to those participating in these forums, first of all, thank you for your leadership. I know that scholars, and I sometimes cringe at this, get a bit of a bad rap for being in the ivory tower, but I have to admit that I probably am. So I've been sitting in my home in Charlottesville, Virginia, though we had a horrible experience here 3 years ago this summer with the neo-Nazis invading. But there was a question previously that I didn't get to answer about what people come to me with. And so I don't think it takes a lot of courage on my part necessarily, although it does in the sense that I was like Eleanor Roosevelt. I was a very shy, introverted child, so it always takes courage for me to come into the public sphere, but I've learned to do it. My mother helped me and mentored me, my teachers and professors did, so I love doing it, and I love sharing my information with you, and I feel like that's my contribution. But you all, like the teachers I teach and the students I teach, you all are the leaders, and some of you are leading through your mentorship and continue to lead. Others of you are going to be the next generation of leaders, and the torch is being passed to you. And I heard, just to finish today, I heard the former chief of police of DeKalb County in Georgia, and he said, I've been doing this for 40 years and I've really tried to make community policing better. He's an African-American man, but he was speaking with a young sociology professor from the University of Maryland, and he said, in effect, I'm passing the torch to you. He said, I've done everything that I can, and so it's up to you now. So we hate to put too much pressure on our younger leaders, but it is up to them. And I will leave with this note. We must do the thing that we are afraid to do, as Eleanor Roosevelt said, but I know we can do it. And for my own parents who made it through the Great Depression and World War II and the Cold War in that Kennedy generation, not to mention personal illnesses and issues like that, I know we are all strong, and I know we can make it. And we're a good country. And as Bill Clinton always says, there are more good people in the world than bad people. So that's how I will leave this today. And again, thanks so much to James and all of you who joined in. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments. And if you have any more questions, please let me know.